In December 2015, Memorial Trustees Lou Lieberg, Bruce Fetzer, and Tom Beaver, and Professor Brian Wilson spent 3 days with Akram Elias in Washington, D.C., comparing Masonic philosophy and Masonic symbolism in D.C. to the writings of John Fetzer and the symbols in his administration building in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I'm Tom Beaver, trustee of the Johnny Fetzer Memorial Trust. This is Brian Wilson, who is a professor at Western Michigan University, and we're pleased to be interviewing Akram Elias, who's the former Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge in Washington, D.C. And we're talking about the existence and influence of Masonic philosophy in the legacy of Johnny Fetzer, who joined the Masons in 1934 and eventually attained the Scottish Rite's highest degree, the 33rd degree, in 1969. Mr. Fetzer was also a York Rite Mason. His Knights Templar robe is in the Fetzer Archives in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and as well as a Shriner. His fez is in the archives at the Fetzer Institute as well. Mr. Elias has graciously invited us onto his home turf here in Washington, D.C. for this interview, and we're privileged to be sitting with him in the House of the Temple, the special Masonic temple for 33rd degree Scottish Rite Masons in Washington, D.C. Beautiful place, so thank you. Thank you for having us here. In 1967 he wrote this, I believe, and in America's Agony is a
kind of an expansion.
It's an expansion of it, but that was written in 1967. So that was the question, whether it could have been a Masonic assignment for either 32nd degree or 33rd degree, whether there was such a thing as, were they encouraged to write their philosophy of life?
Well, this is how I would put it. First of all, Masons were encouraged to ponder, reflect upon the various degrees. In fact, in some lodge traditions, some emphasize it more than others. Even going from one degree to another would require some presentation of some paper, some reflection, either done in written format or verbally. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is that in our ritual, it says that the person need to show sufficient proficiency in the preceding degree to entitle that person to move to the next degree. So how is that actually done? It is done in many ways. But a talk, a discussion, a paper are definitely very much in order. Now, when you get also to the higher degrees, whether it is in the highest degrees, whether it is in the York Rite, like the Knights Templar degree, or at the Scottish Rite, you are definitely encouraged. The introspection, that last year of the higher degrees are very spiritual, and the idea of reflecting on who you are. In some instances, one would even write their testament. So,
well, this a
profession, exactly. So, the way to, of course. So, to me, it's obvious, but it doesn't mean it was prescribed that way to him. That's the key thing.
And in the essay, Mr. Fetzer describes a process regarding the conscious and unconscious minds. So that's also going to be included in this topic. Making man, to John's way of thinking, essentially a spiritual radio antenna. John was a radio engineer, so that was convenient for him to think that way. And John wrote, quote, "The confederations of intelligent entities or cells in the human body are connected through the nervous system to the more sensitive cells of the brain and culminate in a concentrated center in the frontal dome of the head. This in the East is known as the thousand-petal lotus, but in the West is a high-gain parabolic antenna of supreme sensitivity, which is electronically tuned to the incoming rays of the infinite intelligence. This entire body system is known as the subconscious mind. Thus, the subconscious mind of man is in complete attunement with and has every attribute of the universal mind at all times. Every member of the human family, without exception, is the recipient," unquote. And then John goes on to write, the conscious mind is your center of control. But it's the subconscious that's this fascinating thing that he makes the analogy. The question is, first of all, is the subconscious mind, conscious mind process part of the Masonic teachings?
Of course it is. And this is where the exoteric versus esoteric aspects of everything we do in Freemasonry, of all the tools, of the rituals, or the practices. So that it's like the conscious and the subconscious. And the greater, the more successful the individual Mason is in being connected with the esoteric aspect of himself, herself, and the world around him or her. The greater the closer they're going to get to the concept of universal truth, and the more in command of themselves and true sovereign that is they become. We come back to the concept of freedom here. So the lodge provides, again, an environment. And if people want to take it seriously, it is everything that is done in the ritual of the lodge. It is to help the individual connect with his subconscious side. And ultimately, once one is able to do that, and some people are more successful than others, some people connect every once in a while, then disconnect. In other words, there's no absolute one way of dealing with that. But that's when we explain it to the person that when the true power of intuition is. That's basically what it's not instinct. The true power of intuition, it is when you're really connected with the subconscious. And that subconscious is not just for you. It is really part of a much bigger reality of subconsciousness.
So do you see the rituals as a way of developing intuition?
That's the whole idea. Yeah. That's the whole idea. Yes. I mean, the whole idea of going through the ritual, the trials and the rituals use different ways of doing it, including the trials of the 4 elements. That's where the square, is important. There are many aspects. Again, remember, symbols have the beauty of symbols is that they have layers, and individuals can peel layers more than others. Second, they can see based on perspective, based on how connected to their subconscious. They can see certain things in symbols that others may not see, and that is why we say there is no one way. There are all kinds of ways, but we're ultimately...
Well, one thing Mr. Fetzer was very interested in developing was his intuition, because he really felt his business successes were in part based on this.
He said, this was an interview in Psychic Magazine, they did a men in business edition, so men that were willing to speak, to be interviewed for Psychic Magazine, and he said, I don't make many mistakes because I use my intuition. That's why I don't make many mistakes. So he was very proud of it. Well, he said, I don't meditate yet. I have to find a meditation path. But my intuition, yeah. He knew he had very keen intuition. He said, quote, success is a thing that I've always taken for granted, and I should suspect it's because I do trust intuition to the point that I don't make enough wrong decisions to undermine a successful rhythm. I literally order the subconscious mind to do research and come up with the answers. Ultimately, I find the answers. I'm generally able to find the answers intuitively. Or my intuition may lead me into certain types of research to find answers, but nevertheless, the intuitive process is at work.
And the Mason is taught these things through symbols by being him the point. You draw a circle around you using the compasses, and the more knowledge, the greater your experience is, the bigger the angle, the more you can open. It's a very individual based, So you create a circle, and then you have 2 columns representing the duality here, the conscious and the subconscious. And then you have up there is the source of divine knowledge, whatever it is, that you think that's your spiritual enlightenment. And we say, as long as you're doing that and you're touching these, you can never err. That's when you are totally in connection with your intuition, intuitive power, which is part of the divine.
So in the higher degrees, the different symbol systems are essentially a way of developing this skill.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Helping decipher the symbols and then helping the person develop the skills. Absolutely.
But it's a very individual process as well.
Everything.
Yeah.
Everything is individual. The only thing collective is that when we come together in the lodge to operate the lodge, everybody has something to do. And then by participating, by speaking up, by expressing ideas, by having educational, we call them trestle boards, educational pieces, whatever they are, where there's that energy and that synergy that is feeding. And I get more ideas when somebody is talking and I'm learning how to listen in the lodge instead of preparing my thought, how to respond. I'm listening. That ability to simply listen is going to trigger through my subconscious powers, for perceptive powers that are incredible. But if I don't appreciate that silence, that's why we insist on secrecy, by the way, what everybody misses. The reason we say the Mason learns about secrecy, it is not really for not revealing
secret control of America or whatever.
I mean,
of course not.
that you can find. I took an oath. I say I will not, so I will stick, because that's my own obligation. So it's my integrity. I will not do it. But that is not the purpose of it. The purpose of it is to teach the individual silence. Silence is fundamental to help the person connect with her subconsciousness. Silence. Internal, that's where meditation is. Silence when I'm dealing with somebody else. How can I fully understand what the person is telling me, where they're coming from, their life experience, if I don't learn to shut up, silence, and listen, instead of thinking, how am I going to react or respond? That is very important. And thirdly is to preserve the confidences. When somebody shares something to me in confidence, that helps preserve the chain of brotherhood and connections. Otherwise, you create disharmony, negative energy. And that is why somebody who knows how to keep things confidential gains the trust of others. So the practical implications is that you gain status and you gain respect in society by learning to keep your mouth shut. So it's all about silence.
What are some of the other kind of spiritual benefits or effects of the ritual? Because it's such a central part of Freemasonry. And it seems like Mr. Fetzer kept going back to his lodge to re-experience some of these things.
They call it ritualistic magic in a lot of traditions. So do you refer
you're
to
gonna hear different things. Ritualistic magic, you're gonna hear hermetic experience, you're gonna hear the alchemical process, because when you talk about improving yourself, it means you're transforming yourself. There's a transformation process. And there are physical things that are there to constantly remind you. For example, in every Masonic lodge, you're gonna find a rough ashlar and a smooth ashlar, a stone, rough, coming out of the quarry, and then a smoothened one, ready to build your temple, to build the temple of humanity. And the Mason is always told, this is your raw state. This is where you need to go. Nobody's going to tell you how to do that. So you have to do your own trestle board. What is your own strategy to move yourself from this to that, using all these tools, etc. So the more you attend, the more you read, the deeper you dig.
So it's kind of a literal polishing experience.
That's a good way of putting it. A polishing experience is definitely polishing, smoothing the edges so you can build, because we're constantly thinking of building here. Building a better self, building a better community.
But I'll tell you what, in the Rosicrucian Lodge, the lodge rooms are very similar. We'll get a quick shot, I hope, of the lodge room here, but in the lodge, and the ritual is very similar, I would assume, because the lodge rooms are set up very similar. Sometimes during the ritual, once in a while, once in a great moon, during that ritual, the third eye would open for a minute or two, and wow, spectacular experience. Then it would close again, you go about your way. But the ritualistic magic can produce these intense, brief enlightenment experiences as well.
That is the main purpose of the ritual. It is to help the person equip himself with ways to be able to connect with the subconscious, to grow himself then in that, develop that, in order to develop that power of the intuition. And again, some people do it more successfully than others. Some people leave it dormant, but then at one stage in their life, they vest themselves. And I mean, it varies from one person to another, but that is the purpose of the ritual. And we know from even rituals in religions, even in Orthodox types of belief systems, that is the reason why there is an insistence on ritual. I mean, one very interesting thing, and again, there's exoteric and the esoteric. We're told, a Freemason is told, before engaging, I mean, listen to these words, before engaging in any great or important undertaking, a Mason should always invoke the blessing of deity. Now, exoterically, you may say you go pray, whatever, but what is invoking the blessing? We're talking about providence here, the blessing of deity. Okay, so what is that? You see, this is where George Washington prays in Valley Forge. That's what we're talking about. This is when we talk about the stars conspiring on behalf of the experiment, or the stars aligning, or the gods conspiring, or whatever it is. So invoking the blessing of deity, yes. Not simply praying in the traditional concept.
And to do it in the lodge room, to do it in a community, a dedicated community. At Fetzer, it's sometimes referred to as a community of freedom, because John used those words. We'll look at them in Kalamazoo. The power of that invocation can be very intense and very efficacious, I guess you'd say. It can have dramatic short-term effects that are sort of like enlightenment effects, but again, sporadically. Maybe once in your lifetime, or maybe once a month, once a year, but you're lucky you're fortunate however it happens. But that lodge room effect, the community doing this practice together and doing the ritual together, wouldn't you say that builds an intention and an effect that is very beneficial? That's why people keep coming back to the lodge room.
It does, and we call it the sacred chain, or the sacred band of brotherhood. That's what the lodge experience provides for us as a community. It strengthens that, and it creates. I'm telling you, if it varies from one individual to another, because again, people experiences vary. But the more focused on this, the greater one leaves richer than when they have entered. And the richness is not always sensed immediately, but there are certain things one can never explain. I mean, I find myself in situations where I can see something, I can never explain it. I feel something and I act on that. I call those signs. Okay, if you try to explain it, it doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense.
John would say there are no coincidences. That was a common
right.
phrase.
There are no coincidences. Absolutely, there are no coincidences. But the more attuned to that, the more connected one is, that the more one understands that there are no coincidences.
You notice it, then you can notice it.
Yeah, it is no coincidence that my wife, coming back from a trip to Miami, sat on a plane next to a lady who worked at the time at the Department of State. And in a conversation, within 10 minutes, that person said, maybe there's something at the Department of State. I'm not sure there is, but here's a number. Why don't you have him call that? And within a week, Akram started a 10-year thing with State. Now, do you call that coincidence? I don't. And there was an opening within 10 days. I mean, but again, I personally, as a trained person in this initiatic journey, I don't believe in coincidences, and I don't believe in chance.
Next, we discussed with Akram the Fetzer community of freedom as it corresponds to the Masonic Lodge Room, where in both situations you have people of different religious traditions coming together, sitting down and sharing in a common practice or ritual together in order to help each of the participants along their individual spiritual paths. John Fetzer would say that all spiritual streams are fed by the same deep well of spiritual energy and inspiration, while Freemasons refer to invoking the blessing of providence.
It's all about spiritual path, except that there's no one. That what is fundamental, and I can't insist on it enough, and that explains some of the writings, that the essence or what has driven the writings of John Fetzer, talking about that spirituality, is that this is fundamental. There is no one path. Right. Every individual must chart his or her own path, but it is only the spiritual path that will get us there. Right. Not the other.
But there are multiple versions.
But there are multiple versions.
One of the interesting things about Mr. Fetzer is he comes from a very conservative religious background. Mm-hmm. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. But in the 30s, when he joins the Masons, he broadens his horizons considerably. And then he starts reading Hinduism, Buddhism,
Theosophy,
Hermeticism.
Going to mediums at a spiritual scale.
Which makes sense, because the Mason is encouraged. I mean, if you take the Scottish Rite degrees of Freemasonry, for example, I mean, each one of the degrees is digging into or pouring out of the wells of the various esoteric schools, mystery schools, whether from the India traditions, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's the Zoroastrian tradition, whether it's a Judeo-Christian tradition, whether it is a Persian tradition, Egyptian tradition, etc. So no question about it. And there's something else that is fundamental. There's a beautiful piece that Kipling, who was a Freemason, wrote about his mother lodge, talking about the Jew, the Mohammedan, the Christian, the Buddhist, and the Hindu, all in the same lodge room. In every religion, orthodoxy, in every religion, one is taught to love his or her neighbor. In one form or another, it's expressed differently.
The golden rule.
The golden rule. But you see, as a Catholic being in church, looking on my right and looking to my left, everybody else is Catholic. Now, it's easier to love another Catholic like myself. It is easier to love my fellow Jews as a Jew, my fellow Muslims as a Muslim. It becomes a different situation when you, in the ritual of the lodge, kneel at an altar and take an oath to improve yourself and to contribute to the strengthening of the sacred band of brotherhood. But now your neighbor to your left, you're Catholic, he's Jewish, he's Buddhist, he's Muslim. That's a completely different situation. So taking this oath of creating a band, sacred band of brothers with people who are different than you are. So this is why religious tolerance is one of the fundamental principles guiding the fraternity, attracting people of different faiths so they can learn how to appreciate their diversity and respect one another. They can keep the beliefs that they want. Freemasonry tells the person from the beginning, you will take obligations, you will take oaths with the guarantee they will never interfere with your religion, your politics, or allegiance you owe to your country. What you're taught, however, is to avoid extremism no matter what it is. And the tools, because by avoiding extremism, you retain control. By falling into extremism, you lose control. You're being driven by other instincts, other forces that are not yours. My motto, the motto of the Grand Lodge when I was the Grand Master was energize, engage, enlighten. That was the triple E, the triangle.
So energized through ritual?
Energized ritual, engage the community and enlighten yourself so you can enlighten others. And, you know, I mean, to me, in my work, that's what I try to do. I don't say I'm doing this because I'm a Mason, I'm just living that. So I fully understand how John Fetzer did what he did.
In the social hall of the lodge, if you have one, I was a Rosicrucian for a decade, and in the social hall, we didn't talk, as you say, there was not talk about politics or religion, etc., business, but there was a lot of sharing of esoterica, things that people were into, things that people were exploring, finding out about. And John Fetzer, from his Masonic experience, also then developed an interest in theosophy. He had interest in going to psychics and spiritualism. We'll get into that a little more later. So is that the case typically in a Masonic lodge, where out in the social environment more, that there's sharing of esoteric interests, things that people are reading or things that people are finding out about?
Or spiritual experience.
Or spiritual experience.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And again, Masonic lodges do it differently in different ways because there's nothing prescribed. But that is encouraged, and that happens. I mean, all the time in different ways, as I mentioned. For example, I can share with you, earlier in the year, I was in Beirut, Lebanon, where a bunch of, in the social hall, where the whole idea was, discussion talking about alchemy and the whole alchemical, hermetic, and of course I'm wearing a Hermes tie, but that's okay. But the whole hermetic, experience. Every month in Washington, every month, you're going to find at least one lodge. We have 41 lodges in Washington, D.C., the city, the District of Columbia. Every month you're going to find at least one of these lodges do some, organize some kind of what we call more open discussion of these things. And meditation is a big thing, introducing the members to the various forms and ways to meditate, because in the Masonic ritual, that's the main purpose of the Tyler, esoterically. See, everything in Masonry has an exoteric and an esoteric.
This is the doorkeeper.
The doorkeeper. We will tie. So exoterically, that is the guardian, the guy who stands out with a sword, make sure that there are no cowards, no eavesdroppers, nobody who's not supposed to come in, enter. But esoterically, this is where we close the door and we put, as we say, a guardian at our thoughts, at our lips, at everything that engages us into the world, so we can withdraw to the sacred. But to go from the material, purely material, to the sacred, we need a transition and meditation. And it's done symbolically, for example, in a lodge. The master of the lodge would rap once just to tell everybody we're about to start. And then there is a second rap that basically starts the work. Now, in some lodges, after the first rap, that's when you see music, light is dim, and there is 3, 4, 5 minutes of meditation. Some lodges do that in different ways. So there are all kinds of programs like that, obviously, that are discussed. And the pursuit of knowledge. So you had people talk about theosophy, about the Rosicrucianism, and Masons, many Masons have joined various groups as well. They joined some of these other, whether they're Martinists or Rosicrucians.
I'm going to read you a story then. I'll go ahead and read this, a little story, a Fetzer story, because I think it pertains here. In the 30s in D.C., when John Fetzer was struggling with getting the FCC to approve a radio license for him, and he was just about to give up, he wrote his wife in 1938 a letter from D.C. So in the 30s, he's become a Mason. He's a 32nd degree Mason by 36. So in 38, he wrote his wife a letter. The day before, he'd written her a very discouraging letter saying, I'm just in over my head. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm going to go home. And then he wrote her a letter saying, Yesterday I had some fun consulting an astrologer. She said we would win this case and that the whole thing would be settled in 8 months. This was after 6 years on the Hill trying to get this done. This turned out to be completely accurate, and years later, in 1984, John said in an interview regarding this astrologer, he said, quote, "What was her name? Her name was Ella something. It was Ella McLaren. The reason I went to her was I found out that half the senators on the Hill went to her. She was superb. From what I recall, what she had to say was absolutely true. This probably was the experience that excited my interest in parapsychology." So his saying that half the senators on the Hill were going to this woman, then in this context of talking to you, I thought, well, were these the Masonic senators and congressmen on the Hill? Were these the ones that would have an interest in, say, astrology or an interest in other things having to do with esoterica? It would only be a guess on your part, but would that make sense to you that it's continuing this question, really? Masons in the lodge, in the social hall, they would say, well, there's this astrologer who's really good. I mean, FDR, there's stories of FDR Gene Dixon coming to FDR in 44 or so when he got cancer, and he asked her how he could get healed, and she said he couldn't. But would you speculate that the half the senators on the Hill that were interested in other esoteric things may likely have been the Masons who were common in D.C. in the 30s?
Well, I can say the following. There's no question about it that in the 30s, 40s, 50s, those 3 decades, but definitely the 30s, Masonry was very prevalent in Washington, D.C. Membership in Congress, members who were affiliated members, that is, of the fraternity, was obvious. The conference, the Grand Lodges of the United States would hold a conference in Washington, D.C. for the whole country, and it was quite normal to have not just members of Congress, but even the President of the United States attend, address, you name it, in the government, etc. So it was a very prevalent. The fraternity was quite present. Now, when it comes to astrology, I would say that people who rely on astrology or use astrologers, don't have to be necessarily esoteric. They don't have to be members of any mystery school. Many people do that because they believe in it, they pursue it on their own. In Masonry, we don't talk about astrology. We speak of astronomy. Now, of course, people can say this is a play on words. But it is the last pursuit of knowledge in the 2nd degree in Freemasonry is astronomy. And it is not there by coincidence. It is the hardest, the highest, whatever. So how do you pursue that? And by that, what I'm talking about is how below and above are related. What happens above affects below. What happens below affects above, etc. So in the scientific world, we use astronomy and we say, how are the stars, what is happening in the laws of nature that are affecting mood, psychology, the seasons. I mean, we know this is all scientific. Now, the word astrology can sometimes mean something very stupid, very petty, or it could be really much more rooted in. So I stick to the word astronomy for that simple reason. But no question, a Freemason is encouraged to pursue that highest, the last one of the 7.
Because is it true? I mean, my understanding is that in the Masonic tradition about Solomon, in the temple, Solomon's temple, that Solomon was perceived as the master of the Chaldean mysteries and also of the Egyptian mysteries. So the master of the higher and lower mysteries, and the Chaldeans were famous astrologers.
Correct, which explains to you why his seal is the 6-pointed star, which people refer to it as the Star of David, but the 6-pointed star is made up of 2 equilateral triangles The triangle is commonly used as a symbol in Freemasonry, and the equilateral, meaning the three sides are equal. But one is pointing from earth to heaven, or below to above, and the other one is coming from above to below. And again, equilibrium. When they intersect at equilibrium, they form a six-pointed star.
Male, female.
Male, female, above, below, etc. This is all coming from the mystery schools. And this is why you see it above the eagle in the Great Seal of the United States. The eagle, which symbolizes the United States to be free and independent. This is very important under the new order of the great spiritual experiment that the founders established that is called America. That's why I say America is much more than a land and a people and a country. It's really an idea that's going to transform the human condition. It is transforming the human condition. So the eagle in the old order was a symbol of power. Under the new order is a symbol of freedom and independence, enlightened freedom and independence. Now, to be free and independent, you need to balance also the duality. In this case, symbolically, the eagle is holding arrows and an olive branch. So you have peace and war at a state of equilibrium. And then in its beak, you have the banner on which is the motto, E pluribus unum. In other words, to remain free and independent, this experiment needs to preserve the diversity within its unity. We don't pit diversity against unity or unity to eliminate diversity. So how do we keep E pluribus unum, out of many, one? The many don't disappear, but the oneness is above all. To do that, you need to be wise. The United States has to be wise. That's why you see above the eagle 13 stars arranged in the shape of a six-pointed star, the seal of Solomon. Wisdom. We need wisdom. The United States need to seek wisdom to be able to fulfill that destiny.
For the next part of Topic 1, we sit with Akram in Kalamazoo at the Fetzer Institute boardroom, with the Institute's circular Jefferson window as a backdrop. Next we have here a diagram that shows both the Scottish Rite degrees and the York degrees. So we know John Fetzer was a York Rite Freemason as well, because we have a cloak and a robe.
Cape, probably?
A cape and a long robe that have the red Masonic cross on them. The cape has it on the inside over the heart, and the robe has it, the long coat has it on the sleeves. And we've seen the plates that have the Maltese cross on them. So here's, it's silly for me to hand you this because you're familiar with it, of course, but for Brian and I, here's a diagram of both the York degrees and the Scottish Rite degrees. Right. And so talk a little bit about the York Rite and what is the Knights Templar, the highest part of the York Rites. I know the York Rites aren't numbered like the Scottish Rite degrees are numbered, but yet there are a series of degrees in the York Rites as well. Yes.
There are, once a Mason gets his third degree. Now, this is important. The three most important degrees are the 3 degrees: Apprentice, Fellowcraft, and Master Mason. But given the fact that the language used in the rituals, and we have a variety of rituals, there's not one school of ritual, but a variety, they express the same lessons, but in different ways. However, always using the language of symbols. So because of that symbolism, the person needs help, the Mason needs assistance in deciphering. So what is called the higher degrees in Freemasonry are meant to be the tools for those who want to deepen their understanding of the 3 symbolic degrees. Get those higher degrees, not because they're higher in importance, they just happen to be higher in numbers, like number 4 is higher than number 3, for example, in the Scottish Rite. To help that. And there are 2 main schools to do that. One is called the York Rite, and the other one is called the Scottish Rite. No one is better than the other, no one is above the other. They're two different ways of approaching the same goal. And it's in a way to send also a powerful message to the Mason. There is no one path. There are different paths that can lead you. It's all within here. That connection was within is very important. Now, what are the major differences between the two, and what is really the York Rite? The Scottish Rite first is based on numbers. So you go from 4 all the way to 32, and then the 33rd is by invitation only. It is conferred as a great honor for service for the individual Mason. The York Rite uses not numbers, a different set. So there's what's called the chapter, Royal Arch Chapter, which has a series of degrees in it. Then there is something called the Cryptic Council, which has a couple of degrees in it. And then you have the commanderies. And the top degree of the commanderies is the Knights Templar. Now, all these can be obtained by the individual Mason going. So on the York Rite, up to the Knights Templar, one can get. There is no by invitation only, as the 33rd is. The major difference in the ritual used in the York Rite degrees versus the Scottish Rite. The York Rite uses lessons that have to do with the Bible. So the Judeo-Christian tradition, they take the Holy Bible, and the idea is that Holy Bible has all kinds of stories, all kinds of very interesting things that we use in the York Rite degrees as allegories, to organize the ceremonies, but to convey the deeper truths that have to do with that individual's quest for spiritual enlightenment. The Scottish Rite degrees incorporates not only things from the Bible, but it takes from traditions of the ancient Egyptians, India, etc. So from different civilizations, if you want, and spiritual traditions. Just two different approaches, but it's the same thing. In the end, the person going this way or that way is being exposed to ways for him or her to unlock their own higher levels of consciousness to achieve that spiritual enlightenment. That is really the main difference. More biblical based, more universal based, the other one.
Could you talk a little bit about the Crusader symbolism, especially the York Rite?
Yeah, the symbols here that have to do mainly with the knights, not the Crusaders, but certain chivalric orders. Although during the periods of the Crusades, these chivalric orders played a role one way or another in different ways. So you have the idea behind it is that the real esoteric mission of especially the highest one, which was the Knights Templar, that the knights went to the east in search of light. The west was through the Middle Ages, was going through a dark period. Somehow the east, the Islamic world, Byzantium, the Eastern world was much more advanced in science, in technology, in the arts, coexistence among the various religions, Jews under, in that part of the world, etc. So there was a secret mission really for those knights to go there and figure out what is happening and try to gain knowledge and bring it back. So the lesson of this is that these knightly chivalric orders had to do with two things. Number one, how do you better yourself? It's an internal thing. You better yourself by seeking more knowledge. So if there is darkness, you should, there's ignorance, and if you stick with it, you have a problem. So you need to go wherever the source of knowledge is, you go to it. And so there, obviously, it was the east. So you go east to get that knowledge. Second, very important, that knowledge is going to possibly put your life in danger, because as we know, with the history of the Knights Templar, they were accused of becoming heretical, having taken so much knowledge from the Islamic and the Jewish worlds, because they interacted with the Sufis, they interacted with the Ismailites, parts of the Shia Islam, they interacted with the Kabbalists, in Jewish mysticism, and they came back. Obviously, the monarchy, the absolutist monarchy in France, was so indebted to them. At one point, the Knights Templar owned half of Paris, really owned a lot of debt to them. So obviously the best way to absolve your debt, there was no bankruptcy at the time, was basically to get rid of the lender. And how do you get rid of the lender? By convincing the Pope that these are heretics. And since they went and befriended all these Muslims and Jews and heretics, and these Orthodox Christians who are also heretics because they're not following really Rome, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, the Eastern Orthodox.
The Eastern Orthodox, yes. Exactly. So it was easy to do that. And basically they were arrested. The leadership was burned at the stake. So this is to remind the Mason that quest doesn't come cheap. That quest is very difficult. It's a serious matter and may put your aspects of your livelihood, material livelihood, at risk. And so it's the symbolism of the story rather than the actual, thing. That's, yeah.
Well, it's interesting how the story of the Crusaders, as you tell it, is a story of a kind of cosmopolitanism, a kind of acceptance of other religious traditions and other philosophies, which is a very different way than most people think of Crusaders. So this is all part and parcel of Freemasonry as well.
Well, because the Crusades were the Crusades, and there were wars going on, and there were pillaging going on, and Crusaders on their way, the Crusaders on their way to Jerusalem, they pillaged Constantinople, and they, and they were basically told, yeah, everything on your way, this is one way to. Yeah. So, but the knights, these specific orders, have a different mission. So you need to think of the Crusades and the Crusaders, and then in there were a couple of orders of knights that had very specific missions that had nothing to do with this big thing that was going on. In fact, the Knights Templar, 9 of them went there for years. They were in Jerusalem. They took quarters in the place where was believed to be above where the temple of King Solomon was, and they were digging. I mean, these are documented things. They were digging. Nobody knows exactly what they were digging for, but people thought that maybe so were some of the archives that had to do with some of the ancient knowledge that was buried. And then they brought this back to Europe, and then an esoteric monk helped them come up with the concept to create an order and sold it to the Pope, and suddenly they have a rule, and that became the most powerful, within a very short period of time, the most powerful order.
They were also protecting pilgrims' money for them, so they were the banking system.
They created the first, if you want, modern, for the lack of a better word, modern system of banking, where you would go deposit your money, silver, in a commandery. You would get a secret pass, a letter or a code word, whatever. You would go to any other Templar commandery and collect your money. This way you don't have to carry it and be... And one interesting thing, this was one of the reasons they were accused of also heresy. They were accused of being alchemists. I mean, at that time, we're talking alchemy, meaning really accused of transforming metal, into gold or into. And the accusation had to do with silver. They had so much silver. They were wealthy with silver, and for the monarchy, for the church, where could this happen? Mm-hmm. Where were they having that? They definitely were engaging in this devil alchemical process, to the point that the word in French, don't forget the order came out of Champagne, in France. So the French language was their language, and the word for silver is argent in French. At the same time, they had so much of that in French, the word meaning was changed to money. In other words, till today, In the French language, you can say argent, you mean by that either money or silver, because they had so much of that, that became the money of the day. I mean, the Templars are the reason the word argent became also meaning money. And the accusation was they were devil worshipping, they were dealing with the heretics somehow, this alchemical thing, and therefore they deserve to die.
Now, may I also bring this up to see what your comment is? The story also is that the Knights Templars included the Hermetic goddess worship in their trinity of Father, Mother, Son, and Mary Magdalene was important to them, and they were accused as part of their heresy as worshiping Mary Magdalene somehow rather than the proper orthodoxy worship.
Correct, and the Knights Templar were, as an order, was dedicated to Our Lady. Now, this was the code word, Our Lady, Mary. And of course, when you say Our Lady, you know, for the ordinary Christian, you're thinking about Mary, the mother of Jesus. They were dedicated, the order was dedicated to Mary Magdalene. So whenever the word Our Lady was used versus, you know, Mary, mother of Jesus, it was the code for Mary Magdalene. And this is why they built their chapels using number 8, which has to do with the feminine, you know, the octagonal.
So the Templar chapels are 8-sided. They look like circles, but they're octagons.
Yeah. And which is why you see some of that, you know, with whether, you know, Chartres, for example, in southern France, dedicated to Our Lady. That's where you, and then Notre Dame.
Yes,
So, and I believe just recently the Vatican changed the ruling and considered that it was a mistake by the Church, and that the Templars
to have gone after the Templars, that they were not heretics.
That they were not heretics. This just happened recently, I believe, like a year or two ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Fetzer was also a Shriner.
Yes.
And it's interesting because it's the Order of the Mystic Shrine, which has all this kind of Islamic symbolism involved with it, which is interesting in terms of what you just said about the Knights Templar and this kind of positive approach to Islamic knowledge. Is there a connection between that?
Yes, and that's the American. The shrine is an American invention. It doesn't have its roots in Freemasonry, which came, you know, from the old world and principally Europe. As we know it, that is, modern Freemasonry. It is an American invention, and it was thinking of the 3 monotheistic religions, since you have Judaism, you have Christianity, you have the mysticism, with this approach to obviously mysticism, to incorporate, you know, Islamic traditions made sense. Right. And so the shrine was established for the Freemasons who have attained at that time until just recently, you know, not too long ago, they made a change to further expand the ranks of the Shriners to help support their 22 hospitals. The main thing for the shrine is the charity.
You had to be 33rd degree.
You had to be 32nd.
32nd degree.
You had to be a 32nd degree because the 33rd is by invitation only.
Okay.
So you had to be either a 32nd degree or a Knight Templar to be admitted into the shrine. And the idea is now that you've gotten that, you have to come to the big charity. And that is what happened. Children. Children are the future. Children are the innocent, and we have to support them. Children who have problems, they need limbs, they're at wars that cause them to be mutilated, fires, and the idea of supporting firefighters because of what happened, you know, to the Knights Templar, burned at the stake. The idea to, again, counter that. So they created these hospitals where care is provided for free. And the support primarily comes from the contributions of the Shriners. So the shrine was big, and obviously someone with Fetzer's approach to life, enlightened philanthropy, giving back service, love, the community of freedom. Any way you look at it, it made absolutely sense for him to also be a Shriner. And at that time, you know, people he met with also in Washington, D.C. were Shriners. I mean, Harry Truman is a big Shriner, for example. So yeah, that's the idea behind the shrine. It has that inclusiveness, right. The idea again that stresses religious tolerance, respect, etc. And no matter what the path is, we can connect universally through the spirit, and at the same time, loving, creating that loving community is important, and the children are important.
So when I was a boy, the Shrine Circus always came to Grand Rapids once a year, and we always went to the circus in Grand Rapids, the Shrine Circus. And then the Shriners always were in the parades, riding their little miniature toy cars.
Yes, the cars, right.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask. It's associated now, at least, with kind of having a good time, kind of the party order. But how seriously, at least in the beginning, was the symbolism taken? I mean,
well, definitely the symbolism was taken more seriously, but it was from the beginning offered to those Masons that have attained already the high level, the high degrees, that have, and at that time it means you've reached a certain age, you've fulfilled yourself. So you deserve some nice fellowship now through the shrine. This is a good time, opportunity for people to really more socialize, spend good time, fellowship, but never forget that now you're dedicating yourself to charity. So that concept of philanthropy in Freemasonry is strongest and most manifest through the shrine. That is, and the lesson is, once you accomplish yourself, once you succeed, whatever it is you've done, you feel you've fulfilled yourself, you must give back. So this idea of giving back is very important, and that is why charity is the biggest reason for the shrine. Yes.
We always heard about the burn hospitals, the children's burn hospitals. Yeah.
Interesting.
Next, we stand and walk with Akram at the House of the Temple, the special lodge for 33rd degree Scottish Rite Masons. Standing outside, Akram introduces us to some aspects of Egyptian symbolism and of Masonic numerology. Then he takes us into the lodge room itself, where the Masonic ritual takes place, and speaks about the common ritual or spiritual practice done there by Masons of all the various religious backgrounds. Then he moves out to the atrium, where he discusses the concept of hermetic change or spiritual enlightenment. And finally, back outside, Akram goes into York Rite notions about the Knights Templars and the feminine aspect of Hermeticism, specifically the symbol in Christianity of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and also of Mary Magdalene.
Well, we're standing here on the steps in front of the House of the Temple, which is the headquarters of the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. This is where the highest and last degree holders, the 33rd degree Freemasons, gather. And this is the Mother Council of the world for the world of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. You can see again the influence of ancient Egypt with the two sphinxes decorating the entrance. The steps are designed with number symbolism in mind, in sets of, first one is 3 steps, next is 5, 7, and 9. And number 3, as we talked about in Freemasonry, associated with the triangle relating to the 3 degrees. And number 5 representing the fellowcraft, the person who actually builds, which explains why the Washington Monument, George Washington being the builder of this new nation, has a monument that is 555 feet in elevation and 55 feet by 55 feet at the base. The next set of steps is 7, and 7 relates in Freemasonry, as far as numerology is concerned, relates to the divine wisdom. As it is said, the world was created according to, let's say, the Abrahamic, the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition, created in 6 days, and God rested on the 7th, so that's the concept of 7. But we know that white light sunlight is made up also of a spectrum of 7 colors. Number 7, esoterically, is very important to the natural laws of establishing this universe. And ultimately, number 9, which relates to the 9-pointed star that we saw in the temple room, which brings 3 equilateral triangles together in 3 different directions, giving us a total of 9. And the idea behind it here is that the Freemasons join this institution, coming from different backgrounds, believing in different faiths, different religions, learn how to respect one another, pursue sacred knowledge, so they can go outside the world and become builders of better communities and a better humanity. And that is what has influenced to a great extent the thinking and the being and the philosophy of John Fetzer, which led him to have architectural plans to develop the Fetzer Institute with that kind of symbolism in mind for its mission to help prepare people who can do good as far as humanity is concerned. We're standing here by the altar in the lodge room of the House of the Temple. As you can see, on the altar are displayed a variety of volumes of the sacred law, and the idea that in the fraternity, individuals professing different faiths can come together and learn to be brothers and respect one another while seeking enlightened spirituality. If one looks all the way above in this beautiful room, one can see the double-headed eagle with the spread wings, the double-headed eagle focusing here, east-west, the duality, and again, the concept of freedom, enlightened freedom with the spread wings. Now that one can relate a little bit to what you find in the Fetzer building, but instead of the eagles, you have the sun disk, which is the same concept expressed differently. And at the heart here, you will find the triangle that represents always that concept of Trinity, the 3 dimensions, 3 levels, 3 natures, etc., essential in the language of symbolism in Freemasonry. Now, if you take a look over there, you're going to see again the concept of the triangle replicated in many ways. So you end up having 6 pointed stars, almost 3 of them in different directions. That is always highlighting the concepts above, below, but also east, west, right, left, etc. The triangle is one of the most important symbols that we use in Freemasonry, and it's replicated at different levels and in different spaces. Welcome to the lodge room. Okay, and we're standing here in the beautiful atrium. The centerpiece of this House of the Temple, designed by John Russell Pope. The design comes from one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, King Mausolus. This is where the word mausoleum, by the way, came from. As you can see, the Egyptian influence again, the idea that the ancient Egyptians were great builders and Masons are supposed to build better selves and better world. In this room also, you see these wonderful columns, 4 on each side, total of 8. Number 8 esoterically being associated with the sacred feminine, the feminine side of the divine. which is, by the way, the same number associated with the Supreme Court of the United States, since justice is one of those feminine concepts as well. You have beautiful lamps or beautiful decoration here, and you can see Hermes everywhere, because the concept of bettering oneself and transforming the human condition is directly tied to the concept of hermetic change. It's about alchemy, and that is an internal work using spiritual enlightenment to transform oneself and then transform the human condition in order for humanity not to repeat the past and fall into the eternal cycle of war and violence. The Hermetic experience alludes to the alchemical process, which is the process of internal transformation that the Freemason goes through by pursuing enlightened knowledge, enlightened spirituality, transforms himself to be a better person in order then to enable himself, herself, to contribute to the betterment of the human condition. And this is essential in the building process and concept of Freemasonry, that we should never allow humanity to repeat history and be stuck always in this never-ending cycle of violence, that we can always better the human condition. And the establishment of the great experiment that we call the United States is the foundation for that. This is why America should never, never allow history to repeat itself.
Akram discusses Yorkite notions of Jesus and the Marys, Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene.
He appeared to the women, not to the disciples, and let the women go spread the word.
Right. They were at the foot of the cross.
And it was a woman who changed the will of God, if you want to believe in the orthodoxy, that is, he's the Son of God. Right. In the miracle of Cana, when in the wedding, and Mary, his mother, came in and he said, "My hour hasn't come." And now, okay, that's Jesus, Son of God, saying, "My hour hasn't come." In other words, she changed the will of God. Now, that is reestablishing the balance. That's how I've always personally look at that. And that explains to you why the Knights Templar, as an order, were dedicated to Mary the Magdalene.
And were heresies, were heretics. They
were accused, yeah, they were accused of being heretics. And you know, Chartres, Notre Dame, the coded words were Our Lady. Our Lady. And of course, who is Our Lady? So
most people hear Notre Dame and think of Mother Mary, rather than Mary Magdalene.
Sophia is Minerva. I mean, it's Minerva in the Library of Congress.
Yeah.
It's wisdom. But in the Egyptian trinity, it's Isis, Osiris, Horus. It's Father, Son, Mother. It's Father, Mother, Son.
As long
That's
as
the Hermetic trinity.
As long as the feminine is suppressed, there is going to be disharmony, disequilibrium. The cycle of violence continues. We're, you know, so if you want to go back to the history of how we started with the 60s, the beginning of the new era. This is the beginning of some form of liberation of all kinds, disrupting the existing order. There's not going to be an equilibrium. There's going to be two opposites going to war with each other. Instead of having now one suppressing the other, is going to be two looking at each other as equal, but going after each other.
Well, in a mystical sense, too.